what a passage. But Jimmy, you did go to Bible college.
Yes, I did.
And that means you studied the Bible. That's kind of what you got your whole kind of degree in.
I did.
Yeah, so does that mean that then you kind of understand this unlike the rest of us and makes sense to you?
I wish. I think the first image that popped into my head when I read this passage and I realized I'm going to have to talk about it to a bunch of teenagers on Pack 5 is this gif. Like, there is just some gnarly stuff in this passage. You're right, crazy things in there. I mean, somehow Christ or Jesus, says, makes some sort of proclamation to imprisoned spirits, whatever they are. And it's this proclamation happened in some ages ago or in some sort of connection with Noah when he was building an ark. And all that rain and that water from Noah's Ark, somehow it symbolizes baptism, which again has a connection to the Christians that Peter's writing to here in Rome. And then finally Peter, as though he hasn't kind of put enough confusing stuff on the table already, he just finishes by mentioning angels, authorities, and powers because, of course, well, we all know what that means, right? Yeah, there is some pretty gnarly stuff in this passage, you're right.
There we go. Well, great. Well, I've got my popcorn here, so let's go, Jimmy. Can you just, I guess, unpack all that for us?
Ah, yes, no, well, maybe.
Yeah, but on an actual note, yes. What do we do when we get to these kind of parts of the Bible that we really don't understand?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. That's a key kind of question because it's a common thing to kind of read the Bible and wonder, what does this mean and what is this kind of talking about? And definitely this passage here in 1 Peter, it's one of those moments. I mean, there are people way, way smarter than me that have done way more study than me that spent ages debating and discussing and questioning, what exactly it is that Peter's referring to and talking about here in these verses. And in fact, if that is something that really interests you, I'd encourage you to kind of check out some of the different views that are there. You can see the talk that Matt gave, one of the pastors here on our live stream on Sunday. You can check that out kind of on Facebook. But there's actually, in amongst all of the kind of crazy and uncertain things here, there's actually a bunch of really clear things that Peter says here about Jesus. And as I kind of mentioned in question and answer Q&A last week in that time that we had together, that actually when it comes to looking at really tricky passages and working them out, one of the great first steps to do is to look and see, what does this passage actually say that is clear about Jesus and God? And so what I want to do right now, really briefly, is go kind of shoot through 4 things that this passage kind of clearly shows us about Jesus. And then hopefully as we kind of see those 4 things, we might kind of be able to understand why Peter's writing kind of all of this stuff together. 4 things that this passage kind of shows us clearly about Jesus.
Awesome. Sound good. 4 things that clearly show us about Jesus. Well, What's the first one?
Great. Well, the first one that we clearly see here is in verse 18, and it is Jesus suffered for our sin. Why don't you kind of have a look with me? Verse 18, and Peter writes, "For Christ," that's Jesus, "also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit." I remember when I first got my license, I just got my first car.
Aha, yeah, see, I do know that car. There's actually a picture of it in the Pack 5 studio here. The silver Alpha car.
The silver Alpha car, you're right. Well, when I first got my license, I actually reversed ever so slightly and I bumped into a BMW, put a tiny little scratch, probably about that long, on this BMW. But it just so happened that this BMW was painted in some sort of paint that you couldn't get in Australia, only from overseas, and so it ended up costing an extraordinary amount of money to get multiple panels of the car replaced for this tiny little scratch. And I actually didn't have the money to pay the excess for the insurance that it all kind of played out in. And so even though it was my mistake and it was my error, my dad actually stepped in and paid the excess for me so that I could continue to drive my own car and actually survive. Even though it was my mistake and my error, my dad actually paid the cost that I had incurred. And in lots of ways, that's similar way of thinking about what Jesus has done for us. See, because we rejected God as King, we decided we didn't want to live His way, live our own way, and the Bible calls that sin. Because we chose to live that way, the Bible tells us the consequence or the cost for choosing to live that way is death. But here's the thing, Jesus takes that cost on Himself when he suffered and died. That's what Peter says there in verse 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous. It's Jesus, the one who never did anything wrong, the righteous, as Peter says there, suffers for the unrighteous, those who have done the wrong thing. What Peter tells us here is that for those who have come to Christ, Jesus suffered for our sin. That's the first thing that's clear in this passage.
All right, first clear thing, all done.
Yes.
What's the second one?
Yes, well, you know how we're in a challenge kind of phase, and I'm 4-zip on you.
Yeah, don't know why that's important.
Well, I'm bringing that up because the second thing we see clearly in this passage is that death's got nothing on Jesus. See, in the ultimate showdown of all time, Jesus and death went head to head, a one-on-one battle. Winner takes all. 1v-zip is the only outcome that could kind of take place. And as Peter points out, the winner of that ultimate showdown was Jesus. Have a look again at the end of verse 18 and into 19, where it says, he was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. And then at the start of 19, after being made alive. See, Jesus died for our sin, but he didn't stay dead. He was raised to life again. And as Peter points out here, death has nothing on Jesus. He beat death 1-zip because Jesus is better than death.
All right, I can relate to that. Let's keep going.
Yeah, good. All right, 2 down, 2 to go. Number 3, I said we're moving quickly. We're going to keep kind of pushing through. Third thing we see clearly in this passage is that it's Jesus' death and resurrection that saves those who have come to him. Have a look at verse 21. Jesus says, Peter says, and this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. See, Peter's already highlighted that Jesus' suffering has brought us to God. He said that back in verse 18. And now he finishes it off here in verse 21 by saying that it is his resurrection that saves Christians. Jesus' death for our sin and his resurrection to life, again, is how we get to be on God's team. There's no other way. The only way to have a restored relationship with God is through the death and resurrection of Jesus. It's Jesus' death and resurrection that saves us.
There we go. All right, we're flying through. What's the last one, brother?
All right, 3 down, last one. Here we go. The last one, again, short, but it's a huge thing, and that is that Jesus is the most powerful. Have a look with me, end of 21, verse 22. Peter writes, it saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who, Jesus Christ, has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. Now, there might be some debate around what exactly Peter means when he says angels, authorities, and powers. But what there's no debate about is whatever he's referring to, they're all in submission to Jesus. See, Peter's already said that Jesus is more powerful than death, but he's also more powerful than everything. Death, angels, authorities, powers. Jesus is the most powerful.
Yeah, how good. But here's the thing, Jimmy. One of the questions last week that we had was how do we apply the Bible to our lives? So how do we actually use what Peter is saying in our own lives? Is Peter just dropping facts and statements on us?
Yeah, I mean, that question that came through last week in the Q&A, how do we apply the Bible to our lives? It's such a good question. I love that question. I'm so thankful that it kind of came through, because the truth is, working out how to apply the Bible to our lives, it's tricky, but it really is important. And no, Peter is not just writing to give the Christians a whole bunch of facts about Jesus so they can be smarter. He's writing because he wants them to know something about Jesus so that it might change them. And in fact, that's the whole purpose of the Bible. It's to give us truths about God, about ourselves, so that it might change us, so we might be transformed. And so this part of the Bible, it's written so that Christians then might be transformed, but also so that we might be transformed. And the truth is that the circumstances are different. Peter was writing to Christians in the Roman Empire who were suffering persecution, and that's different to what we're facing here today and the circumstances that we're in. But the heart attitudes, I think there are lots of similarities there, especially if you're a Christian teenager. Here's what I mean by that. I've grown up my entire life going along to church. I've identified that as a Christian for as long as I can remember. But I think the hardest phase of life for me so far in all of that was identifying as a Christian as a teenager. Because it always felt like there was so much risk involved in telling others that I was a Christian, in declaring Jesus. There was always so much risk involved in living out the way I knew Jesus' followers were to live. That displaying thing, there was so much risk involved because my friends and people around me, they often mocked Christians, laughed at what they thought, or what they believed, or the way they kind of behaved. And I didn't want to be on the end of that. And so it was easier for me just to keep my mouth shut and not tell everybody that I was a Christian because I didn't want to be the butt of everybody's jokes. And Christians who lived radically differently, well, they weren't super popular often. They often missed out on stuff, missed out on getting invited to parties and to events. They were often the last to be up to date with the latest goss going on in the social circumstances. And the popular girls at school were definitely not lining up to kind of date the guys who were waiting until marriage to get kind of intimate. And so I didn't want to miss out on all of that kind of stuff. I didn't want to suffer the fate of missing out on all of the things I thought were good. And so I chose often to live in a way that I knew wasn't what Jesus was calling his followers to live. See, declaring and displaying Jesus as a teenager for me, it felt like it carried so much risk. I didn't want to be made fun of. I didn't want to lose friendships. I didn't want to miss out on being part of things, and I didn't want my reputation to kind of be tarnished. I didn't want it to be awkward between my friends, and that because they thought of me as a Christian and what I believed and what I kind of did. I didn't want to lose those relationships because those people mattered to me, and so it felt like declaring and displaying Jesus, it carried so much risk, and I didn't want to suffer for being a Christian. It just didn't feel like that would be kind of fair.
Yeah, 100% get that, because I don't even think back to not even 2-3 years ago when I was a teenager, and I definitely went through that, and it does feel like being a Christian teenager carries so much risk.
Yeah, and maybe you're watching and you're a teenager and you feel like that sometimes. That it's just easier to kind of go along with what everybody else is doing, behave like them, and keep your mouth shut and not tell others that you're a Christian, because it feels like there's so much risk involved in living as a kind of Christian teenager. But if that is you, then Peter's words here in chapter 3, they're there as an encouragement. See, he's writing to remind Christians that it is better to suffer for being on Jesus' team than living like you're not on Jesus' team. That it's better to suffer for being on Jesus' team than to not be on his team at all. See, this little section here, verses 18 to 22, it's Peter's moment to kind of prove that what he said in verse 17 stacks up. Because Peter's highlighting that it's better to suffer for doing good than for doing evil, because Jesus already suffered for doing good, and it resulted in his victory and his glory. See, for those who have come to Jesus, they've had their sin forgiven. Because of his death on the cross, they have a clear conscience before God. They've escaped the consequences of their sin, just like those who escaped the consequences of the flood during the time of Noah. And because Jesus didn't stay dead, because he won a great victory over evil and death, those who have come to Jesus have a sure hope in him, life with him forever. Death cannot defeat those who have come to Jesus, who are on his team. They too, like Jesus, will one day live with God in heaven. And Peter's writing to tell Christians that there is nothing better than that. That there's nothing better than knowing that you're on Jesus' team and living to declare and display how great Jesus is. Yeah, there are risks involved in declaring and displaying Jesus. And yeah, you might suffer for that. But brothers and sisters, know that Jesus knows how that feels. The suffering, the hurt, the shame, the loneliness, the rejection. Jesus knows it all. And he endured it all so that you might be with God, that you might be on his team, so that you might have confidence that he is with you even when you suffer for doing what is good. So keep doing good. Keep declaring and displaying Jesus in your words and in your actions, because no authority, no power, no angels, nothing else, not even death can get between you and Jesus if you're on his team. If you're a follower of Jesus, that's the hope that you have in him. That's the hope that Jesus wants you to know as you face the risks and the challenges of living to declare and display Jesus to those around you.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that, Jimmy. How about I pray? Yeah, dear Lord, I just thank you for what you've done for us, and just pray that as we go forward, that you help us to go forward with a confidence in you, and that we'll be able to say your name proudly, and that I pray that you do help us to take risks for you, and I pray this in your name.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching our latest video. It's been great to be with you.
It's been awesome. Please like and subscribe, and maybe check out some of our other content. That'd be awesome.
And we'll see you guys next week.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.